I think the way our society is set up right now kind of dupes men in that way because we go through the school system, right? Through like high school. And if you go on to college, like even through college, where you're surrounded by your peers, you're surrounded by people who are the same age as you, going through all the same things that you're going through at the same time that you're going through them. And then you get into adulthood and all of a sudden it completely changes. Adulthood is not like that at all. You're around people who are all different ages, all different stages of life. You don't see them every day. You see them intermittently. They're not all going through the same things that you're going through. Your coworkers might be at very different stages of life than you are and dealing with very different struggles. And so it's completely disorienting and super confusing.
Fellas, what's going on? I hope this episode finds you well, and I hope this episode leaves you better than when it found you. Today's episode is with Don Ross, and he is the author of How to Be a Man. And the book is exactly what it sounds like. But it's a great, I think, foundation for guys who came up with all of these twisted and all of these misconstrued ideas about what it does mean to be a man. Because can you define it in a holistic way? And if you can, I want you to come on the show too, because I think that was Don's goal was how do we create a holistic, what I've called an integrated form of masculinity, which is what I think of modern masculinity. And so we talk about it all. So settle in. It's going to be a good one. This is Don Ross. Don, welcome to the Modern Masculinity Pod. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, Hector, thanks for having me.
I'm excited because, well, I just love having these conversations. I realize that in life, there are certain things that I get a lot of anxiety about going to do or going, to. One of them recently was my daughter's cheer camp. That brought a lot of anxiety out of me. And on the opposite end of the spectrum are these conversations, which, are just so enjoyable to have because I think it gives guys like us a chance to have a little bit of a break, a respite from all the world's pullings. And I'd love for you to take us into your world. The question that I ask all the guests is like, what load, what burden, what cross, what muck are you still, mucking through as a guy today that you find yourself still navigating through?
Yeah. I think today I find myself in the muck that I think a lot of guys find themselves in, which is we live in a society and a culture where it's just hard for men to connect with other men. Like it's a very isolating society. There's not a lot of spaces in our culture anymore where men can just get together as men. And I think because of that, we've kind of lost the art of male friendship a little bit. And so, I kind of see it as my like almost goal in life to try to build really good men friends and to help other guys be able to do the same. So that's a little bit of me.
Yeah, it was interesting. I went out on like a guy's night out. It was the dads of all of like the elementary school crew. We call ourselves like the Springbrook Mafia, and we are anything but nefarious, right? I mean, it is literally we coordinate, bicycle riding play dates. And the moms always get a chance to go out. And it was the first time that the guys, dads got a chance to go together. And so we were like, we had a hard time figuring out where we were going to go and what we were going to do. And they, they wanted to go and have drinks and beers and all that sort of stuff, which is fine and great. And we ended up bowling and we get there and it's this really, it's everyone's kind of interesting because like everyone's kind of awkward. And I was like, why is everyone like awkward here? Like, this is weird. And one of the guys finally was like, this is so nice, guys. He's like, I moved here, blah, blah, blah. And I don't have any friends. Like, he's like, this is the first like group of guys that like I can like hang out with and like go and be and feel normal with. And I was like, that I think is sort of what you're speaking to, right? It's like people don't have that. And it's tough I imagine it's tough in this world where guys have responsibilities and the internet and everyone's working remote. And it's just not necessarily conducive to those, friendships that maybe were more commonplace before.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I had lunch with a friend today and he was just saying he and his wife moved to the area where I'm in, kind of near Raleigh, North Carolina, about 7 or 8 years ago. And he said it was just not too long ago that his wife was asking him, like, does this feel like home to you? And he was saying, no, kind of like, not really. Like, I live here and I enjoy living here, but it doesn't quite feel like home. And she said, well, why not? And he said, I just don't feel like I have my people here. Like, there's just, I haven't connected with a group of guys. Like, I know some guys, but I just don't feel like I have, like, if something gets desperate or I really need somebody to call, like, I don't know who that would be. Nobody that I know I'm close enough to, other than like we play flag football together or something. It just is kind of like we're pretty good at this sort of like shallow, casual, our lives overlap a little bit, in some kind of weird Venn diagram way. Like I can do those connections. But when it comes to like shared life and meaningful friendships, we kind of don't know how to do that anymore. And our culture doesn't help us a lot. So I think you're spot on. And I think that's kind of what I like investing my time into.
It's interesting. One of the things I have like a gardens of life assessment that I do as often as I can bring myself to, whether it's weekly or quarterly or monthly or whatever it is. And it's pretty nerdy. But on one of them is like that I measure myself on is like how I think the line item is like man talks. It's like how consistent are you with your man talk? Because I remember when I was going through it and my life was falling apart, it was like if I was able to reach out to a guy and connect with a guy and really have a conversation like this, right, where we just are able to sort of put our shield down and just sort of connect and relate like that for me it was like, oh my goodness, this is a little bit easier. I think like I didn't know what it was or what was happening, but I was like, okay, this is getting easier. I'm getting better. This is helping me move through it. And so it became one of the tools and resources that like I lean on and I go, if like, if things are not where I want them to be, it's like your man talks. You haven't had any this month. Like, no wonder you're off.
100%. I kind of feel like I need that at least every week in order to just be able to kind of keep afloat. Like I think some of it is that, for us as guys, like I think the culture kind of pushes us in the direction of like, as you get out of college and into the stage of life where you're thinking about getting married and, maybe having kids or whatnot, the culture kind of pushes us a little bit towards like leaning on our significant other as like the only relationship that really matters or that really counts in life. And not that you shouldn't be close with your wife, but she's a girl. She processes life really different than we do. And so the idea of being able to talk through the challenges that you're facing as a man and for her to be able to understand it the way that you understand it as a man, it's like it's just not going to happen. And so, I think we all need that. All of us as guys need just other men in our lives who are aware of what's going on in our lives, helping us to see it through their eyes and kind of make sense of it in some ways that our wives just never will. And that's okay. That's not a fault of theirs. We're just different. And it's okay that we're different.
Phew, yeah, I made that mistake. I'm guilty of that huge and just expecting my partner to provide all of my emotional need, right? Like, let alone I wasn't even taking care of myself emotionally. Now I'm putting all of that emotional woundage and baggage onto somebody else. It's like, A, it's not fair. And no wonder things, you know, worked out sort of the way that they worked out. For you, is it a framework thing? Is it a purpose thing? Like when it comes to, what it is that you're doing with guys and why you're doing it, and, if you were to try and sum up sort of your message, does it come down to a framework, a belief, an ethos, a mindset? What do you feel like it's all sort of built around?
Yeah, it does now, but it definitely didn't start that way. I had to kind of fumble my way through the dark for about 20 years to sort of figure out like what did the framework actually look like. And, just the fact that it took me that long to be able to figure it out, I think is kind of a reinforcement of the fact of like, as men, we don't really know how to do this anymore. It's a lost art. It's kind of a foreign skill set. And so, yeah, it does take time. And I think that was kind of my motivation for starting to build a framework was just to say, we need some help here. You guys need it put into a little bit, simpler nuts and bolts. But yeah, the framework essentially is a model that I call tribe.
Well, were there moments though throughout, like, the listeners have heard all about my relationship and kids and parenting and like all that whole arc. But like for you, was there an arc? Was it a moment? Like, how did that come about?
I would say kind of a series of intense moments in my 20s and then sort of a slow building arc from there. But yeah, when I was kind of in my like college and early 20 years, I found myself in a place where I was just really living basically a double life. So I was in college, I was involved in pretty much everything like leadership and faith based that you could find on campus. Like, I was kind of like the stand up good guy, trying to live a life that looked like that and model that for others. And kind of on the side, at the same time, found myself getting deeper and deeper into an addiction to internet porn. And at that time, to date myself a little bit, internet porn was still basically a new thing. I mean, high speed internet was kind of a new thing at that point in time. So it wasn't,
You actually had to download stuff?
yeah, it's wild.
That like back in the day where you you had to store it to your hard drive?
Yeah. Can't imagine what cloud, there was no such thing. Yeah, these were the days of Napster, file sharing was as close as we got to anything. So, at that point in time, internet porn wasn't talked about the way that it is today. It was still very much a taboo, kind of hidden thing in the culture. It was sort of just emerging, despite the fact that, every guy I was around was using it as well. Nobody really talked about it. But for me, I was especially not talking about it because I had, this lifestyle that I was kind of putting up front that was really different than what was going on behind the scenes. And I just really kind of got to a place where, I felt like I had tried everything to quit. Like that was not something that I wanted to be part of my life. It didn't feel like that was true to how I wanted to live and who I wanted to be, but it had its claws sunk pretty deep into me. And so for me, the process, I just really kind of came to a place of desperation after trying, every bit of willpower that I possibly knew how to imagine, from, like taking the door of my dorm room off its hinges, or like giving my roommates in my apartment complex the password to my computer so that I couldn't log on without one of them helping. Like I was doing everything and none of it was really working, and so I just kind of got to a place of desperation with God and just was trying to say, like, hey, I don't know what to do here, but if you can get me out of this, then I'll do whatever it is that you would ask of. And I meant that, but the one thing in the back of my mind that I really did not want to have to do was to talk to somebody else about it. And sure enough, that was the very thing, of course, that he asked me to do. I can remember it real clearly. I felt like he told me that I needed to confess it. And I knew that that wasn't something that he meant that I just needed to do to him, because I'd done that 1,000 times over, but that I really needed to confess it to somebody else. And so, with a lot of fear and hesitation, and, just like kind of unwillingly going into it, I did. I found a friend that I felt like I could trust and had a really hard conversation with him, just sort of bearing my soul and talking about all the ways that I was dealing with this and how much of an issue it had become for me. And that it was causing me to skip classes and miss out on relationships. I mean, just all the ways that porn had really, kind of taken over my life. And that conversation did a number of things for me. One, it didn't kill me, which is what I thought was going to happen. I really didn't expect to come out on the other side with sanity or reputation or anything intact. But I did. And in fact, my friend was actually really kind and gracious and understanding, and actually told me, like, hey, just this week have talked to a couple other guys who are dealing with exactly the same thing that you're dealing with. And so for me, that was like, I didn't understand. I couldn't imagine that kind of like compassion from him and just peace, that sort of came over me. That did not like solve my porn addiction overnight, although it did provide me with a real season of freedom. I think for the first time, I kind of felt like I had this weight lifted off of my shoulders. And that conversation with him really began sort of the process for me of saying, okay, there's something to this openness, honesty, vulnerability with other people, with other guys in particular, that I need to make a part of my life. Like whatever the pathway to freedom looks like, it's going to have to include that. And so that's really kind of where I started, was just saying, all right, I got to figure out how to do this. I started having some of those same kind of conversations with other guys. Some of them went well. Some of them went not as well. I wouldn't say any of them went like terribly, but some people were more understanding than others. Some people were more helpful than others. But all along the way, it was helping me not only find more freedom from porn, which is what I really wanted, but it was also helping me develop relationships that I was like really enjoying. I was getting closer to these guys who were not just like helping me get free from porn, but like were actually becoming really good friends. I was enjoying spending time with them, and we had things in common and we talked about it. And it's like life all of a sudden got richer in ways that I wasn't expecting because of how these conversations and these friendships were developing. So all of that kind of began to paint the picture for me of like, this is a lifestyle that I want. This is something that is going to have to be essential for me. And I think it probably is for a lot of other guys as well. We just don't know it yet. And that kind of started me on the journey of, all right, what does it look like to have guys in my life where we're having these kinds of conversations regularly, where we're challenging one another to get better at the things that we want to get better at and figure out life together. So, yeah, that was the initial sort of impetus. And then it's been just a long kind of journey ever since then of really figuring out, like, hey, what I started to figure out about the whole porn issue was that it was really a manhood issue. It wasn't really about sex. It was about like, who am I as a man? Am I actually trying to become who I want to be? And what am I reaching out for in this porn thing that It's really about filling some other holes that I wasn't aware of that I had. And all of that was related to manhood. And so I started asking some questions about, well, what does it mean to be a man? And I started asking my friends the same thing. And none of us knew. We didn't have an answer. And so, all of that kind of rolled into the same journey of just saying, all right, I need to try to figure out what it is that I'm actually looking for as a man and in trying to be a man. And I need to build some other male friends around me who are wanting to do the same. So, yeah, that's kind of where everything began.
What was that process like of filling those holes?
Yeah. So one of my favorite authors is a guy named John Eldredge. He wrote a book called Wild at Heart, which is a kind of a famous, guy's book, I think, at this point. But he talks about the idea that he uses this phrase saying that we are wounded in the place of our greatest glory. And what he means by that is that the places of our deepest pain, blackest shame, the places that we want to hide from the world the most because either the hurt is the most or the embarrassment is the most or whatever. Those are the places where we as men are actually meant to be able to offer something to the world. That's where our biggest place of value actually is. And we've been kind of intentionally targeted in those places. Our wounding doesn't happen by accident, and it actually happens in some really specific places for us. So for me, some of that was learning to kind of identify the messaging that came along with some of that wounding related to manhood and porn. Because for me, the messaging around porn was you're not a man, you're some kind of a perverted version of a man, and you're weak because you can't figure out how to get out of this on your own. All of that was kind of wrapped up in my struggle with porn. And so, what I had to begin to sort of figure out was like, all right, none of that is true. Okay. Let's just start with that. None of that is actually true of me, but it feels true. There's enough, the best lies have a little bit of truth in them. And when I looked at those lies, I could kind of see there's something there. Like there's some evidence. If I looked at my story, especially as it related to porn, all of that felt true. And if I wanted to find some evidence, I could find some evidence that suggested, yeah, I'm kind of weak. Yeah, I don't really have a handle on my sexuality. This whole porn perversion thing, there's something to that. That just wasn't the whole story. And I was making those lies the whole story about me. And so learning to be able to say, actually, there are some other things about me that really are true and to come to believe those kinds of truths. So on the flip side of that wounding was not only that wounding that was telling me I'm not a man. I'm some lesser version of a man because I'm perverted, I'm weak, I'm, whatever. Can't figure my shit out. What was on the other side of that was actually I am a man. I'm a very strong, capable, confident man. And I'm meant to be a leader of other men. I'm meant to help offer to men what this whole idea of manhood is really all about to help them gain some freedom as well. And so, of course, that began to make sense. That's I think, the wounding opposite the glory kind of idea that Eldridge is talking about is being able to say, if that's what I'm meant to offer to the world, then of course it would make sense that that's where I'm being taken out. Of course, that's where those lies are being aimed at for me, is because if I can buy into that cheapened or broken identity, then I don't stand a chance of actually living out the really good purpose in my life that I'm meant for, because I'm going to be stuck in some really false beliefs about myself. Yeah, there are some holes here and they're there on purpose. And if I can learn the truth that's actually meant to replace those things, not only do I gain some freedom, but I actually begin to gain some purpose as well. I get a sense of who I actually am, who I'm meant to be, what I'm meant to offer to the world. And man, that's empowering, not just freeing, but empowering.
Yeah, a lot of guys, I think, well, there's the shame part, which is its own sort of issue. But I think they think it's just the sex or the porn. It's like a isolated thing. And if they whack-a-mole that thing, then, everything will be good. And in my experience and sort of having these conversations and sort of talking to guys about it, it seems like this self-worth part of it is so wrapped up into that at a certain point, that's going to have to be addressed. And if you're just looking at it at this superficial kind of surface level, let's not call it a problem. But if you're trying to treat that symptom, then you're going to actually miss out on the real, the real.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the biggest mistake that men make about porn is that it's a sex issue. And it's it isn't not a sex issue, but that's typically way down on the list of things that it actually is. It speaks to things that are much, much deeper in a man's heart than just that. And I think if we can get to the root of some of those things, that's when we really have a chance of gaining freedom and going after the life that we really want to have.
Yeah, it seems like there's a direct connection, and I don't know, maybe we lose some of the guys when I get my woo woo hat on, right? But your root chakra, like your bottom of your spinal cord, where all your sexual organs are, like that's sort of responsible for your survival. And I think in a weird way, if it's not guided the right way, it can get bottled up. If you're not finding a way to move from just survival up into self actualization, to actually give yourself some direction and some purpose with your life, then all of that energy is just going to get crowded down there. And then guys are like, I need to release this. And it's weird the reasons that guys sort of go down that path. It's a lot of times like starts with like boredom, or like it just starts because they don't have anything to do, or they're sad or depressed. And so it gives them that sort of quick dopamine hit. But it all sort of stems from a lack of self-worth.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that was helpful for me just on the process of, gaining some freedom was an acronym that somebody shared with me called HALTS, which stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired, stressed. And it's like those are typically all of the things that trigger, in this context it was, looking at porn, but it really could be anything. It could be, alcohol, it could be sports betting. That one's becoming even more and more of a problem I think for guys at this point. But yeah, whatever your particular vice is, those are the things that usually trigger it. It's actually not typically about the dopamine hit that you get from whatever feels good about that vice. It's because you've got these other things going on in your life, the negative emotions that we as men, nobody teaches us how to deal with negative emotions. It's basically kind of like from a kid, the only negative emotion that boys are allowed to have is anger. And any other negative emotion needs to either get covered up by anger or covered over by food often. And so, it's kind of like just, find a way to like supplant all of those negative emotions. And then as we get older, the way that we do it is with all of those little dopamine hits, all those vices. So we aren't paying attention to the things that are under the hood there very well because nobody's taught us to. Nobody teaches men how to do that in our culture anymore. Maybe they never did, but they definitely aren't now. And we have way too many ways to be able to try to mask them in our culture today, and it only leads us into further problems. It doesn't actually solve anything for us or leave us feeling any better.
So you wrote a book. Is the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? Am I living in a different universe? You did write a book, is that right?
Yes. Yeah. I wrote a book. It's called How to Be a Man.
I'm like fully imagining that I'm waking up in different realities. But is that a framework? Is it a recipe? Is it a blueprint? Like, how do you think about, how to be a man? I mean, I think you wrote a book on it. Like, what a great, amazing. What's the answer?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would call it something of kind of like a field guide. So it is intensely practical. It's meant to be very helpful for guys. And so, yeah, it does provide some framework. So when I talk about how to be a man, the kind of first half of the book starts out by really talking about this framework for manhood that I call the 5 marks of manhood. In our culture right now, we need a real like baseline understanding of manhood. And I think most of the definitions that we get out there are things that are talking more about how to be a good man and not necessarily about being good at being a man. So, more so what we need is that real baseline idea of what does manhood actually look like? And that's honestly, that's kind of hard to get at. It's really hard to kind of wrap your hands around that as you look at culture and history. So, anyway, without being like too long winded about it, I'll just say that what I came up with is this stuff called the 5 marks of manhood, which are really just traits. They are strength, courage, skill, honor, and allegiance. And the basic idea is if you can display those things in your life, then you are demonstrating what it means to be a man. And the great thing about them is that you can get better at all 5 of them. So, whatever place of manliness or unmanliness you feel like you are at the moment, you're not stuck there. To be able to get better at being a man just means growing in each one of those areas. And in the book, I actually provide some things that I call manhood challenges. They're just ways to be able to help you, kind of level up in each of those kind of 5 categories. And yeah, how to get better at being a man. So that's kind of the first half of the book. The second half gets more into like how to do being a man with other men. And that's where I talk about kind of my idea of what it means to be a tribe and how all that looks together. But we can talk about that some more too.
Yeah, I love these 5 marks, and it reminds me of the one of the first books I read when it came to this whole man thing. And it's interesting as I look at my Kindle and my Audible, I can sort of see my trends of like what I was interested in. There was this moment when my relationship, I haven't talked about this on a recording, but I apparently it wasn't technically a marriage. We had a wedding, but there was no legal documents involved. So someone on the other side of the aisle now is getting pretty uppity about my vocabulary. So we'll say it like that. Regardless, when I was in shambles and I was sort of reflecting on it, I looked back and all of the books that I had gotten were all on parenting and business and even health and eating. And I looked back and I was like, no wonder you're really like, no wonder. It's like it's no wonder why you didn't like this went the way that it went. There was one book at the end which was like about sex. Like I was like, okay, like all right, you missed it, dude. Like totally, totally, totally missed the window there. And the point that I'm going back to is just like I read the book King Warrior Magician Lover. And are you familiar with that book?
Not that one in particular, but I know those archetypes, all the like young philosophy kind of stuff. But yeah.
So it was written, I think, in like the 90s is when it came out. I was shocked at seeing when it was originally published. And I was like, oh, like, why didn't anybody say that this is how to do it? Like, that this is like, why didn't we instead we had, Homer Simpson, Tim the Toolman Taylor, we got Al Bundy, we got and I've gone on and on about that sort of cultural programming that guys get. But it was when I saw those that I was like, oh, like, okay, maybe I don't have, maybe I'm not a 10 at these right now, but at least here's the criteria. And now that I know the criteria, well, now I know the playing field, I know the rules, I know at least what I'm being measured at. I think so many guys come up just not even understanding what really matters because what it seems is that what culture and society tends to say matters like is like maybe 70%. I don't know, pick a percentage, but it's like it's not all correct, right? There's some of it that's good, but then it's missing a whole part of it that you're talking about. I want to play devil's advocate a little bit before we get into the try part, because one of the things that I thought was really good about this, King Warrior Magician Lover thing was talking about let's call them the soft skills, right? Things like compassion, things like wisdom and insight, which I think you sort of acknowledge with the skill. And so I think like that part of it is sort of there. But what really took me in the book was the lover part, right? Was the range that is required for that, whether it's being that's from a lover as like a significant other, a lover in, a familial part, even to a friend, right? Like it's the ability and the range to access that emotion. I think for me it was like, oh yeah, that is part of being a great man too. It's not all just brutish, ness.
Right.
How do you speak to that or handle that or I don't want to say combat, but like how do you approach, that sort of critique or criticism?
Yeah. So I think there's two ways that shows up kind of in my framework. One is exactly as you nailed it. It's kind of in the area of skill. I love that kind of archetype of the lover. I think most men come into their own in that category through the area of skill. It's like learning how to speak your partner's language or how to be able to love someone else the way that they want to be loved. Like those things start as skills. They're not only skills, but I think most men, that's kind of where they start, in terms of being able to figure that out. I think another part of it, the way that shows up in the 5 marks framework is in the area of honor. So honor, the way that I talk about it is really different than I think how most people talk about honor today. It's, I don't use it as kind of like a word that means like integrity or trustworthiness or something like that. Honor is actually kind of more of a morally neutral term that just means you're doing right by the close people around you. So what that can mean is that like if the people closest to you are making really unwise decisions or ungood decisions, and you're making those same kinds of decisions, then they're probably going to hold you in high regard because of just, mob group mentality. That's a little bit of what honor means, that like if you're acting like the people closest to you, they're going to hold you in high regard because you look very similar to each other. So in that regard, honor doesn't have to be a good thing. It can be I'm holding in esteem somebody who's like me. But where it goes well, and I think to your kind of question, is to be able to say, if I'm surrounding myself with people who are trying to uphold a set of values that I want to uphold. Like if I look at some other men who are treating their wives well, who are making a priority of loving their family well, of caring well for the important relationships in their lives. If I'm seeing that as something that I want to value and I'm surrounding myself with men who are doing that, then I am likely to become a man who is doing those things as well. That's the way that honor works. We become like the people who we're closest to. And so that's why it's super important that we as men choose our friends, our close friends in particular, very wisely, is because we're going to end up emulating them. They're going to end up emulating us. We become like our tribe, whether we mean to or not. And so, finding men who are kind of living out that lover phase or stage or archetype, like you're talking about, and doing it well is an important part of that.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of our first episodes was with Philip Folsom, and he's a great guy, and he does leadership training for like companies with like wolves. He like has like a pack of wolves that he like does offsites. It's like totally badass. Fucking the cool. It's the coolest job ever. But his point though, right? Like that is wrapped up into it is that there's no lone wolf. Like that idea, it's a myth. That wolf dies. That wolf is not successful. That wolf is not thriving.
Yeah, the lone wolf is not a good thing. Yeah.
And I saw something on maybe it was X or Facebook or who knows. I saw it on social media. And so, take that with whatever truth it means. And I should have done my research on it before I blasted out here. But I love the idea of it. And it was essentially the idea of the sequoias out, out there Southern California, but that they are these massive, massive trees and that their roots really don't go down too deep. They don't go down too far, but that their roots actually extend really, really far. And apparently, their roots, and it makes sense. And I've heard this a lot with like fungi and stuff, but they actually intertwine and interlink, and they actually link up with the other trees, and they actually share resources. And so that's how they're able to withstand fires and floods and droughts and all these sorts of things. The point of the post or whatever they were saying is that the tree was not focused on securing the most resources for itself, but it was actually most interested in how does it become part of this system, this ecosystem, and how do you sort of find your thriving place or thriving role within that system.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's so much of what I try to talk about in terms of the idea of tribe, that men are really built for living in something that looks like a tribe. And we don't do that at all in our modern society now. It's become so individualistic. The closest idea that we have to a tribe is what we now call the nuclear family, but it just doesn't do much for the idea of what it means to be a man. And so we've lost all sense of manhood as it relates to being a tribe. And I think that's without a doubt something that, in order to be healthy, we as men really have to recover.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I fought so hard to stay in the neighborhood that we're in, which is in Orange County, and we're in Southern California, and it's an otherwise like a very small towny feel, at least in our neighborhood. I grew up in LA where there was no neighborhoodly sense. There was no sense of neighborliness, and there is here. Kids ride around in bikes. They have a bunch of friends like right here, and there's this sort of tribe that they call it the Springbrook Mafia, right? It's like this silly little group of 6 and 7 year old kids and their parents. But I thought that was so valuable for my kids to be a part of that I'm willing to pay 2-3x rent what I have to, like all of these burdens and hardships. And I'm like, okay, now you're just saying, and I'm like, it's affirming in why that's sort of worth it to provide them with this sort of, granted they don't, they're sort of a single parent household, which is even harder. So it's like to surround them with people that can provide those other qualities or set those other sorts of examples or even just create those other sort of connection relationships. I think is valuable, obviously for a family, but like guys need to go out there and create that for themselves too.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's exactly the point there at the end, is that, there just isn't a place that happens for men in our world anymore. And I think the way our society is set up right now kind of dupes men in that way because we go through the school system, right? Through like high school. And if you go on to college, like even through college, where you're surrounded by your peers. You're surrounded by people who are the same age as you, going through all the same things that you're going through at the same time that you're going through them. And then you get into adulthood, and all of a sudden it completely changes. Adulthood is not like that at all. You're around people who are all different ages, all different stages of life. You don't see them every day. You see them intermittently. Like they're not all going through the same things that you're going through. Your coworkers might be at very different stages of life than you are and dealing with very different struggles. And so it's completely disorienting and super confusing because what once felt really, really easy as guys, which was to just have other guys around me doing guy things and enjoying guy friendships, like all of a sudden that just evaporates. I mean, literally overnight. You get out of high school or college and it's just gone. Especially if you move from wherever you had been, you lose all of it. And so trying to replace that becomes incredibly difficult because there's no equivalent structure of any kind really left in our modern society where men go to just be able to spend time with each other. There used to be in, generations past, we had things like country clubs or barbershops or, men's civic organizations or things like that, guys could just hang out. And for all kinds of reasons, some good and some not, those things have just sort of disintegrated. And so men are left without spaces that are just for us as men to be able to connect. And so, if we're going to have that, exactly to your point, we unfortunately have to create it for ourselves. There just isn't anything out there that's going to invite us into it. And so, we have to be intentional to say, all right, if I want this in my life and I'm recognizing that I need it, nobody's going to ask me to be a part of one. Like nobody's standing on the corner, after work going, hey, why don't you come be a part of my tribe? It just doesn't work that way. So if you want that, you have to create it. You have to be the one to say, hey, I think this is important. Would you come be a part of my tribe? And that's really kind of like, that's, what I spend the rest of the book kind of talking about is like, what does it look like to actually do that? How do you create some kind of experience like that? How do you create a group where guys can do that together? And it's not easy. It takes intentionality, but I think it's worth it. It's worth carving that out and creating that space for other men and for yourself.
Yeah. Is there any, I don't know if mistakes is the right word, pitfalls, sharp corners to think about when guys are, someone says, you know what, you're right. I need to start my tribe. And they're gung ho. Is there anything you might caution or advise them against or to be mindful of in that process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say yes. I would say mostly it's that every guy is probably bringing something into the tribe that the tribe is not equipped to handle. Right. So whether it's, something like my story where it's this deep kind of like porn addiction, or it is, like failed relationships or failed career dreams, or something that's just big, heavy, it might be some other form of addiction, some other form of loss, you know, death of a loved one kind of thing. I mean, every guy's carrying something and often multiple somethings to where I think most guys, unless they have some kind of degree or career in counseling or mental health or, something along those lines, most guys aren't prepared to be able to handle that. And so it's just recognizing that like that's okay. Like you're not necessarily equipped to be able to handle that and you don't really have to be. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't go after building a tribe. It doesn't mean that those topics should be off limits to the tribe. It just means being able to say, we may not have all the resources that we need to be able to best meet each other's needs in this environment. That's all right. We don't have to be everything to each other, but we need to be aware of what we can be to each other and be willing to seek outside help in the places where we're not going to have enough to offer each other. And so that way we're not intimidated by a man's struggles. His struggles are welcome, within the tribe context. But we also can say, like, brother, we're not going to be enough to really help you, in all the ways that you need help in this. We'll walk with you. We'll, be the accountability that you need to make the steps that you need to take, but we're not going to know the roadmap necessarily through this situation. And that's all right.
What were you surprised about yourself, or what did you learn about yourself that surprised you? So writing.
In writing the book, I would say what surprised me was that, well, I'll say this. What surprised me the most was that writing was fun. I didn't initially set out thinking that it was going to be that way. I wanted to write, but everything I had been told about it was like, writing a book is the hardest thing you'll ever do. It's so laborious. It's such a difficult task. And when it's finally done, you'll be so glad it's done. I actually loved it. I really enjoyed everything about the process and would do it all over again and probably hope to at some point. But that's maybe not exactly what you're asking, but that was a big surprise. I would say when I think about like what surprised me was, gosh, probably just the amount of stories that I was able to come up with of both in my own life and in other men's lives of how I had seen these things play out and be true. That the things that I were talking about were not only helpful to me, but were far more universal than I even thought that they would be. And, of course, I hoped they would be a little bit. Otherwise, what's the point of writing a book if it's not, generally for lots of other people? But it just really kind of helped me to tap into the fact that, like, yeah, this is a season in our world and in our culture where men are just, we're just kind of adrift at the moment and we need some help. And that's not a bad thing that we do, but it was good for me to be able to see like the value of what I was doing and how it could really be helpful for other men. So that was more of a surprise than I expected it.
Love it. Why don't you tell people where they can find when they might be able to find and expect the book?
Yeah.
And if you got any other social medias or websites that people can follow up or stay connected as well.
The book is out now, so you can find it on Amazon if you want to. How to Be a Man by Don Ross. And I would say if like anything from this conversation has kind of struck a chord with you in terms of, yeah, I can resonate to being that guy who is dealing with something that feels like it's more than I know how to handle or a battle I don't quite know how to fight. I'd love to offer to your audience a free guide that I've put together that's just called Pathway to Freedom. And it's really about what are the first steps that you can take to be able to help address the lies, the addictions, the, whatever pit you kind of find yourself in and begin to find a way out of that. So you can go to manhoodtribes.com/freedom and download that free guide right there, manhoodtribes.com/freedom. And that'll help get you started. And it also is kind of a gateway into if you're interested in working with me and finding more out about the coaching that I do. There's some information there to help you get started.
We'll link all that up in the show notes as always. And the last question for you, Don. In your opinion, what is the definition of modern masculinity?
Kind of as I said it, as it relates to the 5 marks of manhood. I think modern masculinity is really like possessing those traits and demonstrating them so that others understand that you are a man and then striving to get better at each of them.